Berlin, April 20th, 1945. The city no longer breathed. It shuddered. The sky above the Reich Chancellery was a bruised sheet of steel, split again and again by Soviet artillery flashes that looked, in strange moments, like a grotesque fireworks display celebrating the end of a nightmare. Dust drifted through the air as if time itself were disintegrating. Every tremor from the bombardment shook the chandeliers inside the marble hallways, making them flicker like anxious hearts. Hitler turned 56 that day. He looked 90. His body was a collapsing house. One hand trembling uncontrollably, eyes sunken like two burnt-out lanterns, skin grey with insomnia and chemicals, breath shallow as though afraid of itself. He walked through the corridor slowly, cautiously, like someone trying not to wake ghosts. And he knew, though he would never say it aloud, that everything now happening around him was not the collapse of an empire, but the collapse of the lie he had lived inside for 12 years. Outside, Berliners were carrying buckets of water through the streets, scavenging for potatoes and hiding in underground stations where the screams were muffled by concrete. The 1,000-year Reich had aged 1,000 years in a month. Hitler descended into the Führerbunker around the hour when daylight stopped meaning anything. The air smelled of wet cement, stale tobacco, sweat, and the sour heat of overworked electrical generators. It was a tomb before it held a corpse. The rooms were low, claustrophobic, lit by yellow bulbs that flickered like sick insects. Maps lay sprawled over tables, but they were no longer charts of territories. They were charts of loss. Every front arrow that once pointed outward now pointed inward, converging on a single dying city. Generals whispered. Secretaries cried silently. Footsteps echoed as if the walls were swallowing sound. Hitler sat at a table, hunched, staring at nothing. He muttered to himself about phantom armies he had invented, Steiner's non-existent counterattack, Wink's imaginary panzer troops, divisions that existed only in his memory of 1941. He was a man trying to command shadows. There were moments, long, terrifying moments, where he slid into silence so deep that even those closest to him feared to interrupt. He would stare at the ceiling with eyes that seemed to search for something no one else could see. Perhaps he saw the ghosts of Stalingrad, the ruins of Warsaw, the dead children of Hamburg and Dresden. Or perhaps he saw nothing. His hands shook constantly, his speech slurred. His anger came in bursts that drained him instantly, like old batteries sparking for one final time. He ranted, then fell into sudden heavy stillness. He shouted, then whispered. He blamed betrayal, fate, the weather, anyone except himself. He still spoke of victory, but the words sounded like an artifact dug out from the rubble, brittle, forgotten, absurd. He was afraid, but he would rather die than admit it. Eva Braun entered the bunker like a candle brought into a cave. She still smiled, not out of hope, but out of habit, or maybe loyalty, so blind it became its own kind of tragedy. She tried to make the rooms warmer, tried to talk about things that no longer existed, like sunny days or lakeside walks. Her presence softened him for moments, small moments, the way a song might soften the memory of a war. Hitler looked at her with a strange combination of guilt and resignation. He loved her not with joy, but with tired acceptance. She represented the last fragment of a life that had never belonged to him. A life of normalcy he had destroyed by becoming something larger and darker than a man. In the end, she asked for only one thing: to die with you. And he agreed, because even monsters long for someone to sit beside them in the dark.
Each day above the bunker grew louder, more violent, more final. Soviet troops pressed inward like the tightening jaws of a predator. Buildings collapsed, streets vanished under smoke. The once grand city became an ocean of rubble and fire. A pianist played in a ruined theater until a shell took the roof off. A mother carried her child through the smoke as if walking through the end of the world. Groups of Hitler youth fought with desperate bravado, their rifles shaking in their small hands. Berlin was dying, and the bunker felt every pulse of that death in its walls. April 29th, 1945. Deep underground, in a cramped conference room, Hitler married Eva Braun. It was quiet, awkward, and strangely intimate. They signed the papers while artillery thundered overhead like an uninvited witness. Eva wore a simple black dress. Hitler's hands trembled so much he could barely sign his name. They exchanged vows, not in the name of love, but in surrender to fate. Then they returned to the bunker hallways, where the air tasted like dust and failure. With the war lost and the Soviets only streets away, Hitler dictated his final political testament, a document soaked in denial, blame, and self-justification. As he spoke, his voice cracked like dry wood. He blamed everyone except himself. He defended everything that could no longer be defended. He clung to ideas that had already turned to ash. Goebbels listened, worshipful to the end. Bormann recorded the words mechanically. The secretaries typed, while tears fell onto the paper, because they knew they were writing the final chapter of a nightmare. When the document was finished, Hitler leaned back in his chair and exhaled with the heaviness of someone who had been holding his breath for years.
April 30th, early afternoon. The bunker was unusually silent, the kind of silence that belongs in hospital rooms and execution chambers. Hitler paced his quarters slowly. He petted Blondie, his dog, for a long time, then fed her a poison capsule to test whether it worked. When she collapsed, something inside him seemed to collapse as well. He gave handshakes, formal, distant, pointless. He thanked some staff members with surprising politeness, as if trying to perform humanity at the last possible moment. His voice was softer than he had been in years. Then he went into his private room with Eva. They closed the door. Minutes later, two sounds came, one dull, one sharp, like the cracking of a rotten branch. When the door opened, the world as they had built it had ended. Assistants carried out the bodies, wrapped in blankets. They placed them in a shallow crater behind the chancellery, poured gasoline, and set them alight. The flames rose into a sky choking with smoke from thousands of fires. Hitler's body burned not as a dictator, not as a symbol, but as a small, weak, mortal thing, flesh and bone no different from the millions he had condemned. It was not justice, it was not redemption. It was simply the end. Above ground, Berlin continued to fall apart. But inside those flames, something far older was dying too. The mythology, the illusion, the monstrous dream of power without mercy. And when the fire died down, only blackened fragments remained. Fragments carried away by the wind, disappearing into the ruins of a world he had set ablaze. The bunker is gone now, buried beneath ordinary streets, but the story survives, not as glory, not as tragedy, but as a warning written in the deepest ink history possesses. The last days of Hitler's life were not dramatic. They were not noble. They were not grand. They were hollow, shrinking, claustrophobic, the interior collapse of a man who had once set out to reshape the world and ended by hiding underground, afraid of the very sky. A man who had believed himself a titan, but died, a prisoner of his own delusions.